For all the talk about law and order, few things are more consistent in American history than conservative violence. From the Civil War to the January 6th insurrection, moments of conservative backlash have often been punctuated not with debate, but with bloodshed. Now, you'll hear the same tired counter-arguments whenever this comes up. But the KKK were Democrats, but John Wilkes Booth wasn't Republican. Those arguments lean on party labels, not ideology. The reality is that in the 1960s, the political parties realigned. Democrats embraced civil rights, and conservatives migrated to the Republican Party. The ideology didn't change, only the party affiliation did. What's important is not the letter after someone's name, but the worldview they defended: hierarchy, tradition, racial order, and the suppression of change. That is what we mean by conservative violence. And history gives us endless examples. Take John Wilkes Booth. People love to throw out the fact that he was not a Republican, but Booth's allegiance wasn't about party membership. He was a radical, pro-slavery conservative who believed he was saving America by murdering Abraham Lincoln. He pulled the trigger not in the name of progress, but in the name of stopping it. That moment was the first great act of political terrorism in America, carried out by someone who believed that violence was the only way to stop social change. If you're new here and want to see history told honestly and without the whitewash, make sure to subscribe and like this video. It really helps us reach more people who want the truth about the past. After Lincoln's assassination, the United States faced an enormous challenge: rebuilding the nation and bringing 4 million formerly enslaved people into freedom. For a brief window, known as Reconstruction, there was real progress. Black Americans were elected to Congress, schools were built, and civil rights were written into law. But conservative forces in the South saw this as a direct threat to their power and way of life. And how did they respond? With violence. The Ku Klux Klan was not simply a group of men in white robes burning crosses for intimidation. It was a paramilitary arm of conservatism. Its mission was to stop change, to stop Black Americans from voting, to stop progressive policies from taking root, and to keep the racial hierarchy intact. These weren't fringe actors. They were deeply tied to local power structures, with judges, sheriffs, and politicians often looking the other way or openly supporting them. This is where we need to tackle one of the most common counter-arguments head-on. People will say, but the Klan was made up of Democrats. That is technically true. In the mid-1800s, Democrats dominated the South. But the key point is ideology. The Klan wasn't fighting for democratic tax policy or foreign affairs. They were fighting to preserve white supremacy, traditional hierarchy, and conservative values. When the Democratic Party began shifting in the 20th century, those very same ideologues moved into the Republican Party. The Klan's ideology didn't disappear. It just found a new home. The violence of Reconstruction wasn't limited to lynchings and terror at night. There were full-scale massacres. Colfax in 1873, where over 100 black men were slaughtered after defending their elected government, and Wilmington in 1898, when a democratically elected biracial government was overthrown in an armed coup led by white conservatives. These were not isolated incidents. They were organized, calculated campaigns of conservative violence to stop social progress. This pattern repeats itself throughout American history. When conservatives feel their power is slipping, when change threatens to level the playing field, violence becomes their tool of choice. Before we go further, take a second to hit the like button and drop a comment below. Do you think Reconstruction could have succeeded? After Reconstruction collapsed, conservative violence didn't vanish. It simply became institutionalized. Instead of roving militias, the terror of white supremacy was baked into law, culture, and daily life under what we now call Jim Crow. This was the era where Black Americans were forced into second-class citizenship through literacy tests, poll taxes, segregation, and constant threat of violence. Lynchings were not random crimes. They were public spectacles designed to remind entire communities who held the power. Families brought children to watch. Postcards were printed, and newspapers reported them as a form of social control. This wasn't hidden. It was an open system of terror meant to enforce conservative order. And once again, we should pre-rebuttal a common argument. Critics will point out that Southern lawmakers were Democrats at this time. So doesn't that mean Democrats were the party of racist violence? What mattered wasn't the party label, it was the ideology. These were conservative lawmakers defending hierarchy, racial segregation, and traditional social roles. When the Democratic Party shifted left in the mid-20th century, supporting civil rights, labor rights, and progressive reform, those same conservatives switched to the Republican Party. Strom Thurmond is the most famous example, but he was hardly alone. Jim Crow conservatives justified violence by claiming they were defending law and order. But whose order? Whose law? When progressives pushed for voting rights, better schools, or fair wages, conservative leaders painted those efforts as chaos, communism, or an attack on traditional values. And that language often opened the door for violence. Think about it. If you convince people that civil rights are a threat to order, then violence against those pushing for equality suddenly looks like self-defense. We can also see how law enforcement itself became part of this system. Police weren't neutral arbiters of justice. They often worked hand in hand with white supremacist groups or carried out the violence themselves. Civil rights activists in the 1950s and 60s weren't just facing mobs of angry citizens, they were facing sheriffs, police chiefs, and local government.
By the mid-20th century, the struggle against conservative violence reached a breaking point. The civil rights movement pushed directly against Jim Crow, and conservatives across the South and beyond responded with brutality. Peaceful protesters were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, churches were bombed, families were torn apart by police dogs and fire hoses. This wasn't a few bad apples, it was the predictable outcome of a system built on enforcing hierarchy through force. And the violence wasn't just at the street level, it struck at the very leaders of reform. Medgar Evers, assassinated in his driveway. Martin Luther King Jr., shot while advocating for both civil rights and economic justice. Even Malcolm X, who had begun to move toward building bridges and broader coalitions, was killed. The assassinations weren't accidents of history. They were consistent with the long tradition of conservative violence against anyone who dared to threaten the old order. Here's another common counter-argument we need to address. Some will point to John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's assassin, and argue that he was a Democrat. But this is misleading. Booth wasn't defined by party registration. He was defined by his ideology. He was a reactionary conservative who believed in racial hierarchy and violently opposed emancipation. His politics align with the same conservative tradition that carried through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and opposition to the civil rights movement. Party labels shifted. The ideology did not. And that brings us to today. Violence carried out in the name of conservatism hasn't disappeared. It has adapted. The language of law and order is still used to justify harsh crackdowns on protest. The language of defending tradition is still invoked against movements for gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial justice. From the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 to the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th, the through line is clear. When progress threatens hierarchy, some conservatives respond not with debate, but with force. The targets change: abolitionists, union leaders, civil rights activists, immigrants, LGBTQ+ communities, but the logic is the same. So here's the question. If we understand this legacy, what will we do with it? Will we excuse it as the past, or will we finally recognize the patterns and break them? Thanks for watching, and if you want more honest, fact-driven history that doesn't sugarcoat the past, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us push back against the same forces of denial that have always tried to silence uncomfortable truths. When we step back and look at the long arc of American history, a clear pattern emerges. From the colonial militias suppressing indigenous resistance, to the slave patrols and lynch mobs of the South, to union-busting armies and the assassins of civil rights leaders. Conservative violence has never been incidental. It has been central. The ideology at its core has always been the same: preserve hierarchy at all costs. Whether that hierarchy was based on race, class, gender, or sexuality, the conservative instinct was not to negotiate, but to dominate. When challenged, it reached for violence as the ultimate defense. And this is where we need to dismantle one final myth. Some argue that conservatives only became violent recently, or that the parties flipped in the 1960s, and therefore history can't be traced in a straight line. But that's not how ideology works. Labels change, parties realign, yet the underlying commitment to hierarchy and tradition over equality is what defines conservatism. And that is the common thread linking John Wilkes Booth to the Klan, to the segregationists, to January 6th. It's not about shaming individuals for their political leanings today. It's about facing the truth of our history. If we don't understand the continuity of violence in defense of hierarchy, we risk repeating it. And we see echoes of it right now. Efforts to roll back voting rights, efforts to criminalize protest, efforts to restrict women's bodily autonomy, efforts to demonize immigrants and LGBTQ+ people. None of this exists in a vacuum. It's part of a much older tradition of conservative suppression through force and fear. But there's another side to this history: resistance. Every wave of violence has been met by people who refuse to accept domination as destiny. Abolitionists who risked everything, workers who stood on picket lines, civil rights marchers who braved dogs, hoses and guns. These weren't isolated heroes. They were part of a long chain of struggle for freedom, equality, and justice. That's the legacy worth embracing, not the violence of those who cling to hierarchy, but the courage of those who fight for liberation. And in telling these stories honestly, without whitewashing,